Start precisely on time for our online audience. Okay, yep, I'm going to start in a minute. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this conference on science advice under pressure on behalf of the scientific advice mechanism of the European Commission. I'd like to welcome those of you joining us here in the room. It's great to see so many faces, but also the many, many more of you who are joining us online for this afternoon and tomorrow's discussion. Oh, sorry about that. That was just to make sure you were awake. My name is Jackie Davis. I will be your moderator throughout the 2 days for the plenary sessions at this event, as we discuss the challenges of giving scientific advice under pressure through a series of panels and interactive sessions. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our host to welcome you more formally. If you want to join our discussion, you have a question, you have a comment to one of our panels, please do so in writing via Slido. You'll see slido.com, put in the hashtag 448448, and please be as brief as possible so I can see at a glance who your question is for and what it is you want to know. If you want to make a comment, you can also do so, but again, please, very brief so I can incorporate as many of your questions and comments as possible in the limited time available. If you want to tweet out about what we're discussing here, and please do, let's get this scientific advice message out there far and wide. Please use the hashtag SciAdvice22. So with me on stage, I am delighted to welcome our host for this event. We have with us Professor Eric Lambin, a member of the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission, replacing Nicole Grobert, who unfortunately is unwell and could not join us. And I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Antonio Loprieno, chair of the Board of Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, SAPEA, and president of ALEA, the European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities. Thank you so much for having us here. Thank you for hosting this event. And Eric, over to you first to kick us off.
Okay, welcome everyone, whether you are in the room or online. Professor Antonio Loprieno and myself are extremely delighted to open this conference together. The British writer Jonathan Coe has one of his character in the novel Middle England, saying this about academics. Academics have that habit of focusing obsessively on one subject and letting the rest of the world go unremarked and unnoticed. Well, while this is slightly unfriendly to scientists, it does ring true somehow. There's a certain insularity of the academic world. In his recent book, The Engaged Scholar, great reading, Andrew Huffman writes, "The academic is the one who would rather be right than useful." Within academia, there's a so-called Sagan effect from Carl Sagan, the American astronomer. The proposition is that scientists' research productivity is perceived as being inversely proportional to the amount of time spent on outreach efforts. And indeed, Carl Sagan, despite being an excellent science communicator and a great advocate for science, was denied tenure at Harvard University and was rejected by the US National Academy of Science on the first round of votes. Looking at the data, the opposite is true. Wider dissemination activities by scientists are correlated with higher academic performance by that scholar. And in fact, the implicit social contract of scientists is that they have a responsibility to provide a service to society. Academia is the intellectual conscience of society. We as scientists are expected to develop knowledge that is trusted, and in most cases, that can be useful. Scientists and scientific institutions must get better at bringing useful knowledge to bear. As my colleague Pam Matson wrote recently, research communities cannot do their thing in isolation and just expect decision makers to pick up the results. This rarely works, end of quote. Scientists themselves need to go beyond knowledge production. They need to ensure that adequate mechanisms are in place to bring this knowledge to the relevant quarters of society. On the other hand, policymakers are facing a world that is increasingly complex with multiple intertwined systems that are highly dynamic. Today, we are more than ever under pressure. We are dealing with a series of interconnected crises. A war at our border, millions of refugees, exploding energy and food prices, major droughts in several world regions, the multiplication of which being a symptom of accelerating climate change, a pandemic that's still around, affecting today large Chinese cities, which disrupts supply chains of industrial products, and therefore erodes the purchasing power of poor households who then vote for populist leaders. You get the picture. These challenges cannot be tackled one piece at a time. Common sense alone is not sufficient to address these. Not even any single scientific discipline can. These challenges require a systems approach to problem solving and a multidisciplinary approach to scientific advice. Interactions, spillovers, unintended consequences are the norm, not the exception. For example, the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism was designed and equipped to be multidisciplinary and systemic in its approach to science advice. And yet science advice itself is under pressure, largely because the timescales of political decision-making and of scientific research and assessment are widely different. Long-term for a policymaker is at most 3 months, while for us scientists, it's anywhere between 300, 3,000 or 30 years, depending on your disciplines. For a rapidly unfolding crisis such as COVID pandemic, experts were widely consulted and had a major influence on political decisions. But that was not without challenges and controversies. For slow crises that will end up being much more severe in the long term, such as climate change and biodiversity loss, many experts feel that the call for urgent action is at best ignored. Frustration grows among climate scientists because their work has largely failed to spur governments to fully address the climate issue at the scale and at the speed that are required. A A couple of months ago, a few climate scientists launched a call to their colleagues to stage a mass walkout to stop the research until nations take action on global warming. So much for scientific advising. A growing challenge is also to combat misinformation. As a first-hand experience, one of my best friends fell into the trap of conspiracy theories during the COVID lockdown. For months, he bombarded me with videos and articles from self-proclaimed experts. I was stunned to discover the abyss between science and fake science, which is sometimes presented very convincingly for the untrained eye. I also discovered the loss of legitimacy of the experts in the eyes of this friend. My scientific credentials didn't mean anything to him anymore. I was just part of the conspiracy. As a last note, science advising needs to reach out not just to public organizations, but also to the private sector and to civil society organizations. Because there's no solution to today's challenges that does not require strong partnerships and coalitions between governments, private actors, and civil society. To conclude, what science brings to the policy are first, independence and objectivity, because it is based on evidence. It informs, but does not dictate. It expands the scope of choice available to decision makers. It inspires critical thinking and nuance in public and political dialogue. But of course, this only happens if it first establishes trust and practices respect. I'm sure these core values will be displayed throughout this conference, and we all look forward to lively exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Lambin, for that very inspiring start. The importance, therefore, of science, its role, you all know how much it matters for society, but some of those challenges, if it is to play that role effectively, going to come back on all of those issues over the next 2 days. Now, delighted to give the floor to Professor Loprieno.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. In the name of the European Academies of Science gathered under the umbrella of the European Science Advice Mechanism, it is now my pleasure, after Chief Scientific Advisor Eric Lambin, to welcome you to this conference and follow up on the thoughts he just shared with us. Why are we, as European scientists and scholars, interested in science advice at all? Because as scientific community, we have come to realize that science does not operate in isolation, but within a socio-political reality with which, since the Enlightenment and the foundation of the first academies of science, it stands in dialogue, and from which it ultimately also derives its legitimacy. As European scientists and scholars, therefore, we have become increasingly aware that adequate social transmission and political adoption of scientific results is just as important as the academic production of good science. But we have also become aware that this transmission and adoption of science needs to address quite a different audience and respond to quite different needs from those we usually produce science for. In our knowledge-intensive societies, science has gradually acquired what we might call a translational function. The specific translational dimension of science, which we call science advice, has become more cogent in our time of digital communication, in which with 2 mouse clicks, we can enjoy both immediate access to a Nobel Prize-winning paper and to a Twitter of a conspiracy theoretician. 2 mouse clicks separate us both from a better version of Leonardo's Mona Lisa than the one we can admire in the Louvre, and with today's pictures from Mariupol. The necessity to have political decisions informed by scientific evidence has now become a visual component of our existence as scientists and as humans. Take the pandemic and the Ukraine war. Science cannot and should not claim to be the only dimension in political decision-making. This would lead us to a kind of 19th century scientism, but that science should never be falsely construed when engaging in policymaking. While in healthy political environments informed by a considerate science advice, political decisions are enriched by the variety of legitimate scientific opinions, in an unhealthy environment, science communication is silenced, and science advice is reduced to provoking self-fulfilling prophecies in support of political narratives founded upon fake news. But why did we decide to describe current European science advice as being under pressure? Because the context and the interpretive paradigms have changed dramatically. Max Weber was the first to defend a view of science refraining from moral and political values, which in his opinion are the prerogative of policy decisions. These positions fostered the idea of a so-called independent science advice. Max Weber argued for the independence of science from political economy against the background of the national economists who thought that political economy as a discipline should be at the service of good government. But it remains indeed a question what an independence from science can really mean, even in democratic settings like ours in Europe, when virtually all of us scientists are public servants and thus at least morally bound to uphold the interests of common good. Independent science advice probably means, therefore, independent of immediate political pressure, but certainly not independent of a clear allegiance to the shared values of the Enlightenment. This is the context for traditional European science advice, with the different science councils, Wissenschaftsräte, Conseil Scientifique, etc. Bodies of eminent scientists and scholars whose judgment on specific topics would ideally inform considerate political decisions. This model, however, has recently come under pressure. First, through the increased presence of science and of academic institutions in social life. Universities, and to a lesser extent academies, have turned into agencies of economic and social innovation, and society has developed expectations in exchange for its willingness to fund our research. Thus, gradually, over the last 15, 20 years, science advice has not been limited to august bodies operating more or less in isolation, but has rather turned into a dialectic between science and policymaking at different levels, from seeking an impact on the perception of science in general in society to trying to exert an impact on political decision-making. The last 2 years and the last 2 crises have dramatically accelerated this trend and have brought about yet another change. During a crisis, and we have to recognize that the speed of information provided by the digital tools makes a crisis more visual and thus even more critical. During a crisis, a government needs scientifically informed answers now, not after the august body of scientists has reached a consensus, which for very good reasons that Professor Lambin just explained requires time. What has happened, therefore? Task forces, not committees or councils or boards, have been privileged. Task forces that can accelerate the production of information, probably at a lesser quality than if there had been time to decide, but in an interdisciplinary manner and perhaps not always good, but good enough. This is precisely the pressure we refer to in the title of this conference. And this is where we as organizers need to learn from you. How to deal with this tension, how to make it productive, how to found solid science advice in times of what we might call a critical turn. Perhaps it is to be feared that while COVID-19 or the Ukraine war are indeed real empirical crises, it is unlikely that once the pandemic is over and Russia has hopefully left Ukraine, we shall return to a kind of Olympic calmness without pressure. I do not hope for it, but as a cultural historian, I am afraid that the pressure is here to stay for a while, so we better deal with it in an intelligent way. I wish us all 2 days of critical scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Antonio. And as you say, if that pressure is here to stay, how do we deal with it? How do you deal with it? And I like your phrase, make it productive. That is going to be the red thread, if you like, running through all our discussions in a program where we're going to have 4 panels. We're going to talk and start with the issue of scientific advice under fire. You talked about tensions. What happens when those tensions spill over, boil over? We're going to hear and discuss that. How close is too close? We're going to talk about the complex role of a government science advisor, which you've both already alluded to. And as you said, science not operating in isolation. What are those? How do you deal with the complexities of the role? Climate change, we talked about that. When science meets politics, we'll look at the case of climate change. And we'll look at science advice in times of crisis and really focus in on COVID, what its impact was, what we learned from it, where we go from here. We're going to have some workshops. You're going to have an interactive policy simulation session later on. And at the end of the 2 days, we'll try and pull all the strands of this together. We're going to hear again at the end from both Eric and Antonio with some closing thoughts, and also from the Director General for Research and Innovation in the Commission. Gentlemen, thank you so much for a really inspiring start for our discussions. You've set the challenge of what we need to talk about beautifully. Now it's our job to try and deliver some answers to those challenges. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with those tensions. Everybody in this room knows, of course, that debate, criticism, controversy, dissent, that is all part of the evidence-based scientific process. But what happens when it gets out of hand, when under intense public scrutiny, it spills over? How can science advisors deal with those pressures? What sort of support do they need? And do our panel have any advice for those who may not have experienced it yet, but may do so in the future? That's what we want to talk about in this session. And I'm delighted to welcome, joining us online is Professor Dame Anne Glover, who was the first Chief Scientific Advisor to the President of the European Commission and Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland, and now President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Great to have you with us, Anne. Thank you so much for joining us, albeit remotely. You will see her in a moment on your screens, ladies and gentlemen. We also have with us, and please do come up and join me, Professor Roger Pielke, who teaches and writes at the University of Colorado Boulder on a range of policy and governance issues, and has been conducting some research. It's a 16-country evaluation, I believe, of science advice during COVID. And you've also experienced, I think, your fair share of comment from members of the scientific community. We're not just talking about the public here. We have with us Professor Matt Flinders, political scientist at Sheffield University in the United Kingdom and chair of the university's Policy Engagement Network UK. He's also founding director of the Sir Bernard Crick Centre for the Public Understanding of Politics. Great to have you with us as well, Matt. Thank you. And Professor Lara Pivodic, assistant professor at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels and a member of the Young Academy of Sciences of Belgium in Flanders. And you have given advice, I know, on a lot of issues, policy and issues relating to end-of-life care, but also, going back to controversial issues, assisted dying legislation in Austria. So you've all had experience of being in the front line. I just wanted to quote to you a couple of numbers, and then maybe I can come to you. And Anne, just to say, throughout, when you want to jump in, this is very much a chat, a conversation. Signal to me, I'll bring you in. Don't always have to wait for me to ask you a question. But I just wanted to put some numbers to you from a survey that was done by Nature magazine. 2/3, and this was scientists who had advised, had talked to the media during COVID. And the survey said 2/3 reported facing negative experiences of one kind and another. 60% had experienced attempts to damage their credibility. 22% had faced threats of violence, 15% death threats, and 6 of them had been physically attacked. So that gives us maybe a snapshot, but only a snapshot. And from your point of view, what experiences have you or your colleagues had of coming under real pressure, that hostility we were talking about, as a prominent scientific advisor giving advice very much under the public spotlight?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, and it's lovely to be with you virtually. It's an interesting question because, yes, of course, I've certainly come under pressure and I've had personal attacks and so on. That's partly because we have social media now. I think if we'd gone 20 years ago, we wouldn't have seen the same thing. So as you're in the public eye and you're talking about evidence, if people don't like that evidence, mainly because, and I'm talking here not so much other scientists, but talking about the public not liking the message they're hearing, which is about the evidence, then the easiest thing for them to do, because it's sometimes quite hard to criticize the evidence, is to attack the person. And so, you know, inevitably that's what happens. And I mean, particularly when I was at the European Commission, that was very obvious to me, and that people were quite vociferous in attacking what I was saying when I was talking about the evidence. But I suppose the interesting thing for me is that it's actually probably quite a small number of people. It's just that their voice is amplified. And the sad thing in life, but this just doesn't pertain to science advisors, is the vast majority of people who may welcome and support what you're saying about the evidence are more or less silent. So what's heard is this loud, noisy, attacking group. And I think you probably, I mean, as a science advisor, I think it's sensible to put that into perspective and just to remain true to what your goal is, which is to, if you make the evidence visible.
But must be hard sometimes when you face that level of attack to remain detached, to stand back, for it not to get too emotionally invested in it. Roger, from your perspective, do you have personal experience of real hostility, or among colleagues? What sort of impact is it having? And would you agree with Anne that this is really a phenomenon of the social media era, that it didn't happen before, or not in the same way?
Yeah, let me first say it's great to be here and see human beings in the flesh who aren't boxes on a screen. And thanks to the organizers. This is a fantastic topic, obviously timely. I agree with everything Anne said, and I'd add to that the pressure is on experts because experts matter. Experts are important, and that pressure, I agree, is not going to be going away. I've had lots of experiences. For the next 2 hours, I'll be giving a lecture. No, I'll give you one anecdote. I've testified before the US Congress in an advisory role many times. In 2013, I gave a testimony that summarized the consensus position of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in my area of expertise. A few months later, I was attacked by the White House in Washington, D.C., who posted a 6-page commentary about me personally on the website. I think I'm the only academic in US history to be attacked by the White House in that way. 1 year later, a member of Congress then used that as the basis to investigate me, which led to severe career disruption that continues to today. And for me, it reinforced the importance of institutions of science advice to support science advisors, but also, just as important, the norms that we have in our community. Experts and scientists are people and political actors also, and it's very easy and convenient to exploit how politicians attack experts for either advancing your own preferences, advancing academic gain. So we have a lot of work to do. And the last thing I'll say, for the past few years, I've led a consortium around the world looking at science advice in the pandemic. And I'll be talking about that today and tomorrow. But we have learned a lot of lessons in the pandemic. If there's any silver lining to such a global tragedy, we have all gone through it together, and we know a lot more about advice how it works and how it doesn't. And I think we're in a good position to improve things going
And
forward.
we'll be looking at those lessons in our session on COVID tomorrow. Can I just quickly follow up by saying, Anne gave us a hint as to how she has dealt with those pressures and what she feels you need to do. How have you dealt with, I mean, it can't get much more severe than the White House itself. How have you dealt with those pressures?
Well, I have tenure in an academic university, so I'm pretty comfortable in my job. I also have a character flaw that I'm pretty stubborn and very public, but I responded by, I basically live my academic and professional life in public. Everything I write, every thought I have, every policy position I have, I put it out in public. On my funding, I'm completely transparent. And so I try to turn social media as an advantage. It does have some of its downsides, but I find that it's very comforting to live my life out in public, and I'm pretty used to it now. And I'm sure some of you have seen
You
me
clearly
out
have
there.
a particularly resilient character for dealing with it. Be interesting what advice you have later on for those who may not be so resilient. But Matt, you research the sociology of blame, the politics of blame and so on. How do you see this? Have you had personal experience or anecdotally of the level of pressure and hostility that people come under?
Well, the pressure's certainly growing. I mean, what's interesting and really important for this event is that pressure can be good as well as bad. And I think a lot of the things that have happened in recent years create huge opportunities for science to engage in ways that weren't possible before. And we need to be careful not to lose sight of that. The big issue is, I mean, when it comes to the media works with a focus on blame and sensationalism, and controlling the media is incredibly hard. Actually, giving advice in policy environments, I've been a special advisor in the Lords and the House of Commons. I mean, what a lot of the policy advice is really based on is pre-existing relationships. And it's that relationship component that is massive. That's the glue that holds things together. That can really protect you. But one of the interesting things that Roger raises is I actually don't have I might look like somebody with a thick skin, but actually I don't have a thick skin. And there are really important EDI dimensions within this whole debate that we've never really opened up yet. And I hope we do that today.
Sorry, EDI?
Yeah, equality, diversity, inclusion.
Yeah.
Most academics nowadays don't have tenure.
Yeah.
You know, that's the big challenge and change in academia.
Yeah. So when you feel secure in your professional position, you can deal with it better than when you don't. Lara, complete the picture for me. As I say, you've worked on some pretty controversial issues, difficult issues. Have you personally experienced immense pressure, hostility, or among colleagues? What's your experience here?
Fortunately, no outright hostility so far. But immense pressure in the sense that my colleagues and I give scientific advice to governments and civil society organizations on questions of end-of-life care, palliative care, and assisted dying. And especially when it comes to assisted dying, it's an issue where there are many ideological, cultural, religious differences in positions, and that often clash. And as a science advisor, it's very difficult to navigate this terrain because there's great polarization with the positions being those opposing assisted dying legislation, those who are in favor of it, and very little, with very little attention to the huge gray area that's in between that. And so the danger, the pressure on me as a science advisor in this context is that if I give a particular message based on evidence, depending on what it is, to be pushed on one side or the other. And then everything I say is kind of interpreted through a filter.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's enough for me to say that I work in Belgium, and that's a country where euthanasia has been legal for 20 years now, for people to think, oh, so what you say, you will probably defend the current legislation and argue for it. And so my role is really to try to draw people's attention to the gray area, to the complexity, and quite
people don't like gray area. They don't like complexity. They want, particularly, and politicians want very simple answers. They hate it when you give them gray. So do you, I mean, that's hard to do, isn't it? That nuance is part of the answer here. When you're communicating science, to talk about what's the gray area, what's known, what's unknown, what's completely unknowable. Is that for you one of the ways you deal with it? And I'll come back to you, Matt.
Yes, because I think that controversy, at least in my field, controversy is greatest where the blind spots are.
Yeah.
Because that's where people's beliefs, ideas, ideology comes in. That's not to say sometimes, obviously, there are areas in science where the data are very clear and still there's controversy. But in my field, that's what I really see. So when people say there's a slippery slope and assisted dying, then we go, well, the data is not so clear on that. So for me, then that's really the approach is then to call on funding for research to be able to fill those blind spots, and also advise policy in the sense of this is where we need resources.
Matt, you wanted to jump in?
Just following on, I think there's a real basic issue here that we have an environment in which often we think science has the answers. And actually that sets up false expectations that you can only fail. One of the interesting things in the UK is that we've had ministers consistently explaining decisions on the basis that they were following the science, the experts, and denying that the science was varied. Now, that doesn't mean the science is wrong. It means that life is messy and science evolves. But the bottom line is, as scientists are expected more and more to move from the sidelines onto the platform, onto the public sphere, then if you put your head above the parapet, someone's going to take a pop at it. And we need to be far better as a community in looking after each other.
Come back on that support network in a minute. And could I just bring you back in, because just on this issue of communicating uncertainty and the degree to which that adds to the pressure and the hostility, people wanting simple answers where there are no simple answers. And there was a 2019 report from an independent expert group of the chief scientific advisors, which gave some advice about things to do. And one of the things it said was you have to analyze, assess, and communicate those uncertainties and the diverging views. You need to be honest about that. But does that make, when it comes to withstanding these pressures and the hostility and the threat of violence, does that make it more difficult? Or do you think it is one of the ways to withstand that hostility, because you're acknowledging that this is a difficulty, that it's not black and white? Is that part of the answer or part of the problem?
Okay, so that's a difficult one. I'm going to say I think it's part of the problem. I think you should do it. You should always talk about the uncertainties, and you could talk about risk as well, because it's okay to have quite a high degree of uncertainty if the likely impact of a negative outcome is low, but not the other way around. So it's one of the things that we haven't really touched on so far is this idea of science advice. And we need to be careful about that, because often what scientists are doing is talking about the evidence. The advice bit is the next step down the line. So you might present the evidence to, say, politicians. It's up to them to think about your evidence that you're presenting, as well as other areas of evidence. They could be philosophical, economic, electoral, political, and so on. And then come together in order to think about how you act and what aspects of the advice that you take on board with you. But the uncertainty bit, I mean, I've said this lots of times before, scientists love uncertainty, of course, but politicians hate it, because what they want to know, I mean, there's the old Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the UK, who said what he most wanted was a one-handed chief scientific advisor, because if you ask them anything, they always say, well, on the one hand, and that isn't helpful to a politician wanting to make a decision. So we should talk about the uncertainty, but we should not have that as a hostage to the impact, the positive impact of what we can do, because people can exploit the uncertainty if we're not smart in how we communicate it, in order to say, well, okay, she's advising us to do this, but she herself is saying there's no certainty around this, so we should just ignore it if it doesn't fit someone else's point of view.
Thank you. And very true, one of our audience, Jacek Kolanowski, talking about uncertainty help or hinder trust in science and science advice? It's both in a way, you're saying, but also when it comes, Roger, do you think to the hostility side of things, when it gets nasty and sometimes physically dangerous, do you think one of the things that expert group report I referred to mentioned was making very clear the boundaries? There's science advice, and then there's policy recommendations. Is that part of the answer, so that you as scientists are more insulated from what politicians decide to do with your advice? Does it need to be clearer to the public?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me start by connecting that to uncertainty. When we talk about uncertainty and we hear policymakers talking about uncertainty, as experts, as academics, as scientists, we go right to thinking about the substance of the advice we're providing. Uncertainty bounds, alternative interpretations of the data. Another way to think about that is when we talk about uncertainty, we're really talking about democratic legitimacy. When we give politicians information in its fullness, with areas of gray, with warts and everything, differing legitimate interpretations from scientists, that puts the burden on the policymaker to make a decision in the context of uncertainty. If we artificially limit the scope of our information, then the policymaker will legitimately say, well, the expert told me to do this. They only gave me one choice. They gave me no uncertainty. And if you're in a situation where you're being held accountable, you might not like democratic legitimacy. So one thing we found in our escape project, looking at scientific advice in the pandemic, is an enormous amount of ad hoc science advice. That is, in different countries around the world, there were many institutions created, many that pre-existed. In almost all cases, they were designing the science advisory mechanism as they were providing advice. And in those situations, it's natural that we had a very wide range of outcomes because, as you say, there was not a stabilization of expectations as to what the advice would be. Are you providing advice on epidemiology? Are you giving us policy options? It turns out in many contexts, policymakers wanted information about policy. They wanted policy advice, not scientific advice. What scientists often provided was technical scientific advice, which was very unsatisfactory in a situation where the policymaker wants to know, what can we do?
I'm just wondering, just coming back to this issue and those figures that I quoted on the survey, the numbers, as I say, that gives us a snapshot of the problem. But do we know enough? Is this problem being taken seriously enough? And the impact it might be having, Lara, on your work and the work of others, the threats that you face. Do we know enough, or do we need more monitoring, more reporting of this? And do we have enough support networks? You talked in different ways. There's a question from one of our audience, from Alison Meston from the International Science Council. Journalists Union says, journalists, union organizers and environmental activists have protection under SDG 16.10.2. Should scientists have similar protections? So both, Lara, for you in terms of the scale of the problem and the support mechanisms to deal with it, do you think we know enough and we're doing enough?
No to both. In the sense of, do we know enough? I think, I mean, it just happened to me once that I rarely tweet about assisted dying. And I think there's good reason. Yeah, I'm reluctant to do that. I tweet much more about palliative care and end-of-life care because that's a bit less controversial. But once I responded to a tweet that was just really, really wrong. And I said that this is wrong. And then I wrote, and the responses made me want to leave Twitter, basically. So no, I wasn't prepared for that. And for some, it's a lot more than that. In terms of protection, I think, I'm not in the place, I think, to say that would we need something like the journalists. With my employer, I think it's the kind of employer that's my feeling that would protect me. Though if that happened, though for instance, there's a lot of training we can follow about how to communicate our research, how to get in, well, how to debate with different parts of society about it. There is almost nothing with how to deal with threats. When does a threat become alarming? When do we need to address somebody? When do we need to go to university and say, this is what I received? I think some of us also have this impulse of going, well, maybe it's not so serious. Let's not freak out about this. Until maybe it's too late.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And indeed, the survey that I referred to earlier showed 44% of people didn't report it at all, said nothing. Of those that did, 80% said they got good support, 10% said they got no support at all. Matt, in terms of supporting scientists, and you said at the beginning, look, this is the media focus. You pop up on the media, there'll be a focus on blame, on sensationalization. Do we need to do more to make sure that scientists are ready to deal with this when it comes their way, make them aware of the personal consequences and what strategies there are for handling it?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, in many ways, the role of an academic in society is changing and evolving as society changes. And we need to develop our training, not just for early career researchers, but all the way through the professional pipeline so that Individuals have far more support within their own institutions. A lot of institutions are incredibly risk averse. I'm not always sure they will look after staff who dare to go into controversial areas. And also, I think we still have a fairly amateurish culture around these issues. My worry is that a lot of academics almost self-censor. They won't get engaged in policy areas that they think are too sensitive because actually it's just too risky for them. And actually, we do need brave scientists, but they have to be supported.
And interesting, I mean, Roger, I don't know, and same question to Anne, when you did come under fire, did you get the support that you needed? There's an interesting question here, I don't have a name to it, but someone saying academics are trained to poke holes in each other's arguments anytime it is possible, and there are good reasons for this. How do you reconcile this with looking after each other more when you're forced, as it said, to step into the public debate? So support, but also, you know, reconciling this with those divergences, differences and so on. Did you get the support you needed, or what would have been useful at the time?
Well, in a word, no. One of the things I've learned, and I was trained as an academic, you poke holes, you have arguments, it's fun, you learn more through disagreement. But in the era of social media, one of the I don't know, techniques, strategies I try to employ, not always successfully, is when I see a colleague, whether I know them or I don't know them, coming under attack for their views, whether it's a young colleague or someone who's expressed his views. I don't judge whether I agree or disagree when I go out and give support to their views. I go out and I defend. They have a legitimate right to express their views. If you want to complain about the substance of their arguments, do so, but don't attack their legitimacy or their right to make the argument. And I think those are the sorts of norms we need to establish. The concept that I'm playing with is inclusive dissent. We do a very good job in the academic community of dividing, but figuring out how to bring in voices. So in the pandemic, we've seen what we call shadow science advice. These groups of science advisors who are not associated with government, who spring up in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Sweden, in the United States, who have a different point of view, and they're posed as an alternative to legitimate government science advisors. How can we create mechanisms to bring those dissenting voices into formal advisory processes so that the public can get a comprehensive view of what the science community believes, even if it's diverse, it's uncertain, rather than saying, we have these people associated with the political right, these people with the political left, who do you believe? And if you're a member of the public, you're obviously not going to use tools of science to make that judgment.
Thank you. And from your point of view, the support you did or did not receive when coming under fire, particularly, I think it was in relation to the GM controversy, and what sort of support mechanisms do you think we need? I mean, there was a reference in one of our questions earlier to a formalized protection under the SDGs. Do you think that sort of thing is the answer, or what would you point to?
I think it's really important that you're supported by the organisation you're attached to. So to some degree, when I was Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland, Scottish Government did give me a reasonable amount of support and also training, training in terms of particularly media training to understand what the angles might be of media and how to get over the evidence without engaging in controversy if that's possible. The Commission less so, and I think it was maybe because the Commission was not prepared for having a Chief Scientific Advisor. I mean, as you pointed out, I was the first, but also the last in the role. So it maybe didn't sit comfortably in the structure of the European Commission. But the Commission more or less just maybe hung me out to dry is too strong a term, but they really weren't as supportive as I would have hoped, to the point where indeed some MEPs, actually some, I would say, high quality MEPs, but with certain views about GM and other issues, actually published articles that simply told lies about me. And I wanted those corrected and asked the Commission to support me in asking for an apology and a correction, and they wouldn't. So it was up to me to go and do that. And I feel, I mean, it was important that I did it, and I did get an apology. But I think that it's really, really important that we have that support from institutions. But can I add on to a point that Roger brought up about these alternative science advice mechanisms that appear particularly during COVID. And I'm only speaking about the one in the UK. And the reason that got traction, in my view, at the beginning was because there was such secrecy in the official SAGE group, which is, the science advice in emergencies. That SAGE group didn't publish its discussion or what the outcomes of the discussion was. So this alternative group talked about the issues, and the advice may have been very similar. It's just that we weren't hearing anything from the other group. And that lack of transparency made people very uneasy. So there's a strong message there that you need to be transparent about the advice that you're giving. And I just finally to say that in the European Commission, although I asked to make public what advice I was asked for and what advice I produced, so to provide those papers and that they could be put up on the website, that was not allowed. I was told that was not appropriate. So the best I could do was to publish my diary, and even that caused some dissent amongst the Commission, saying that you shouldn't be publishing your diary. But I wanted people to know who I was talking to.
Can I just ask, what was the grounds for you not being allowed to publish?
Well, one of the issues was I was told that if I had been asked for a piece of advice, let's say on climate change, and I'd given some background and talked about the evidence around the issue, then particular environmental groups who were opposed to something that the Commission was doing would say, look, they're asking the scientific advisor for this. Why didn't they know this already? This is us telling them they didn't even know this, and they're asking for the evidence now. So they've been ill prepared up until now. So in other words, the asking for advice would be somehow politicized.
Yeah, understood. Matt, I'm just thinking here, I was going to ask, and I think Anne is pointing there when she talks about transparency and how crucial it is also, in order to defend yourself from this sort of pressure or hostility. In terms of frameworks or guidelines that could be produced, is there anything useful? And do you think it's something that perhaps needs more work at the European level or whatever, in order to ensure that we have guidelines for dealing with situations where scientists find themselves in these high pressure, under fire situations, so that we have the right training, the right support? What do we need?
Gosh, there are things we can do. So a practical example about building cohorts of supportive people. In the UK, the Economic and Social Research Council's got a new pilot, 25 early mid-career academics going into Whitehall and Westminster for 18 months. Instead of leaving them to survive on their own, we're bringing them together once a month, often just to allow them to talk through the challenges, tensions, opportunities that they face. One of the biggest things, and I'm often amazed more people don't understand this, is one of the most important self-preservation rules is what I call the no surprises rule. And this is often written into formal policy documents, the no surprises rule. When I'm dealing with ministers, SPADs, journalists, I will always say at the start of a conversation, I'm working on the basis of no surprises rule, yeah? And they'll look at me and they'll go, good. And what that means is they can't say anything about me from that conversation without them asking me, and they know that I won't use anything from them without them coming to me. That means we talk with candor. It means that they know I understand the context and the rules of the game. But for the journalists, it means they can't play too many games. Just
so I understand, it's another way of agreeing very clearly what's on the record, what's off the record.
The rules of engagement.
The rules of engagement before you start.
The no surprises rules.
Speaking with I'm a former journalist, and speaking with my journalist hat on, the one thing I do find often happens is in a conversation, somebody will say afterwards, oh, that bit, that was off the record. And then a journalist might well say, oh no, sorry, you didn't say that in advance. And then you get into, so rules of the game, some advice for people on when talking to the media, what to agree in advance. Lara, for you, is that part of it? Do you see other things that we could provide a framework, some guidelines for dealing with this issue?
I think one of the other things we need to focus on more is that science is a group activity and a group task in these days. It's very rarely an individual activity. But when it comes to putting the spotlight on those who provide evidence, who advise, who give policy recommendations, in my view, it's often individuals. Yep. And so we put the burden on them. the blame on them if something goes wrong, the responsibility on them, and then that also leads to controversy and possibly attacks. So I think what frameworks, what guidelines, I'm not sure would be ideal for this, but really to center the group that came up with an evidence, to put focus more on the organization where they are from, on the broader context in which they work. So if somebody really disagrees with them, they will. I think when one engages with a bigger group, obviously the threat on the individual is smaller, and I think that's one really important thing, way to look at it.
There's a question from somebody in our audience saying, how often do politicians ignore the given advice? And that brings me back really to the question or the point I was making earlier about the boundaries. And Roger, perhaps a comment here in terms of making it clear. Do you think one of the ways to deal with this issue is to make it much clearer, the science, the advice, and the pathway, if there was, to any policy recommendations that have emerged from the science and from the advice? I mean, so we talked about transparency. Anne was talking about how important it was to avoid shadow science groups. But in a broader sense, do you think that's part of the answer?
I think efforts to delineate what's science advice, what's policy are doomed to fail, because this is a very fluid environment. I do think it's important to, and this is where you're going to think I'm a nerd, but we need things like model terms of reference, so that when an organization wants to put together a science advisory body, they know something about best practices for how you structure an organization, what's expected, how it's impaneled, the expectations for how members engage with the media, whether they provide policy guidance, policy options, policy advocacy, or they answer questions and there's some structured relationship between policymakers. So I think clarity of expectation is far more important than trying to draw boundaries and draw lines. What we've seen in the pandemic is organizations sometimes don't have terms of reference. Sometimes they have them, they're very simple. Sometimes they write them after they discover they needed them. And I think we have to recognize, and it's a lot of people in this room and a lot of people in Europe have expertise in the science of science advice. That is actually an important subject area. So if we are going to delineate things, yes, there's people with subject matter expertise. There's people who are elected in their staffs, but there's also people who sit at that boundary at the interface and have considerable expertise and experience in how that works. And we should be drawing on their experience more going forward.
Sure, just following off from that completely, one of the issues here is about understanding and expectations. I think a lot of academics that I've worked with, they'll say to me, I engaged before, and what I said they should do, they didn't do, so I'm not going to bother again. Or they'll say, I'm not going to engage because I know the ministers only want to co-opt me to do what they were going to do anyway. In my experience, that's too simplistic. Actually, you deal with some politicians, that's completely true, but particularly with senior advisors, senior officials, actually, my role isn't to tell them what to do, it's to provide useful knowledge, and that is part of a broader process, a broader ecosystem within which academics now sit. We also need more mobility. Final point, we don't want to see them and us. We need to have structures that allow academics to move more into policy environments, research-related environments, and we need more policymakers to be able to come in and out of academia. The great problem we got is that braided careers, and there's a big EDI point here, braided careers are incredibly hard to make work. Once you're in academia, you're either in, once it's very hard to leave and then come back in.
Point of advice being ignored, and the questioner asked how often does that happen. I think this is something we'll also come back to in our next discussion on focusing very specifically on the role of government science advisors. But for you, and I wanted to link this to something that Eric Lombard said, he quoted someone, I can't remember who it was, saying academics would rather be right than be useful. From your point of view, when your views conflict with those of the politicians you're advising, or cultural norms or whatever, do you think it's more important to stick to your guns and be right, or to frame your advice in a way that makes sure you will continue to be listened to? I think this is something we're going to come back to time and again over. I was very struck by an interview yesterday CNN did with Dr. Briggs about handling life in the White House under Trump and how she decided to handle it. But is it more important to maintain that influence, to continue to be listened to, or to be right? And I link this to the question of hostility, because it's about defending, defending the science, defending the advice you gave.
Yeah. So if you're not listened to, I guess you're pretty much useless as a science advisor. So it's important to be listened to. But in terms of, you said, if I was sure I was right, or my views, what I would always say is any science advisor who's doing their job properly, it won't be their views, their individual views. They should be talking about the consensus of scientific opinion around an issue. So, it's not just me, it's also the views of European Academies of Science Advisory Council, or ALIA, or, whoever it is. It's the broad spectrum of views. This is where the body of evidence is. And then, if that is uncomfortable for those who you're advising, my strong view would be that they need to be transparent about that. So let's take the GM issue, because you talked about that. Every scientific academy or whatever will agree all across the world, and they've all looked at this and they've all said the technology is safe. But many governments, because the citizens don't want the technology for whatever reason, say, oh, there's too much uncertainty around that. So what they're doing is they're distorting the scientific advice. How much better it would be if they said that the scientific advice says that this technology is safe. However, you, the citizens, do not wish to use this. And until that changes, we will legislate against its use. And then citizens have the opportunity to say, well, if it is safe, are there any advantages to using it? What are these arguments against the technology? And then we start having a decent debate. But politicians often just use scientists or scientific advice. So where the scientific advice agrees with what their own political philosophy is, then they're happy to talk about it and say, as our scientists tell us. And if they don't agree with it, it's because the science is uncertain, or there are different views. There are always different views in the science. So I think we could challenge those who are in receipt of the advice to be more responsible about how they talked about it and to be more transparent. And actually, just let me, as I've got the floor, let me say one thing on this negativity that has been focused at science advisors, particularly during COVID. A lot of it is linked to other prejudices. So by far the worst trolling and negativity that I have seen is against women, because there are a lot of people who are sexist and misogynist, or people of color. So if you're not basically a white man, people will attack you because they're racist, or attack you because they're sexist or misogynist. So female science advisors have a particularly hard job, but in one way I'd say it's slightly easier, because you can clearly see that it's not what you're saying that's being attacked, it's who you are.
Because they'll attack you in that very personal way on grounds of your sex or your colour.
Exactly.
And so it's clearer what it is. Lara, I wanted to come back to you, because going back to the comment you made right at the beginning about, because I'm from Belgium, and because in Belgium we have legalized euthanasia, there was an assumption about where I'm coming from in the assisted dying debate in Austria. For you, when you're, if you like, so you're in the cultural mainstream in your country, but you are discussing these in another country where there is more intense debate about it. For you, did you feel in that discussion it was more important for you to be right, or to nuance it because it's an Austrian audience? Did it affect the way you approach the advice you gave?
I fully agree that if people don't listen to us, we're useless. So yes, we need to make people listen to us. I think to make people listen to me, I need to listen to them first. And that's often proven very useful. So if you go to this particular example, for instance, in Belgium, the assisted dying is very much, the implementation of it is kind of integrated with the mainstream healthcare system. It's not a parallel route. And then talking to civil society organizations in Austria that were involved in consultations when the law was drafted, they were insistent that this needs to be away from the national healthcare system, it needs to be something parallel, and then me giving them the evidence on why that's not very useful didn't help at all. So then I really needed to listen. So what are your concerns? What is it? Why do you think this is bad? What do you think will be the consequences? What are you afraid of? And then basically the answer was fear of abuse, obviously. So then I can pick in on that. And then I say, so this is what we know for which safeguards need to be implemented, and actually integrating it with regular healthcare prevents abuse. And then I was more listened to, let's say. So I think that's it, listening, especially if it's a different cultural context. In my case, I am Austrian, but I work in Belgium, so I'm navigating two contexts, but yeah, listening.
You could address that cultural divide, as it were, as well. Roger, just a quick one on this. I want to come up to another couple of questions from our audience, but for you, you described that situation where you came under fire. It was the White House leading the charge, as it were. Did you think, looking back, well, maybe if I had nuanced things a bit, I could have avoided the attacks and therefore had more influence? Or did you think, with your resilience, no, I'm right, and they really need to be listening to me, and you were therefore prepared to withstand that hostility?
Yeah, well, it's complicated because, I mean, the last thing you would expect is to represent the consensus position of the IPCC to a democratic US administration and then have them attack you for it. I think the only reason that I was attacked is the YouTube video of my testimony, my 5-minute speech, got 400,000 hits. And so I became influential. My voice was being heard. And for me, it's if you're an academic and like me, you study policy, you think, yeah, I want to have influence. I want my voice to be heard. And then it gets heard and you think, well, maybe I didn't want it to be heard so loudly. So I think this is
I should have said it, but I should have whispered.
Right. This is one of the ones where we have to train young scientists, early career professionals, because we're all about science communication these days. Go out, get on Twitter, get a blog, put your voice out there, tell them what you think. Well, guess what? Sometimes people might listen to you. And so we have to prepare people for what that might mean professionally and how to deal with it and how to respond to it.
Because otherwise, of course, the risk is of that chilling effect, that they do it once, it was so bad, they never do it again, and they never put their head above the parapet.
Absolutely.
Not everyone is resilient as you. Just wanted to come back. There's a question from Dominique Leglou, who is editorial director, Sciences and Avenir at La Recherche. Here we are. It's easy to attack the media, he says. How do you deal, though, with fake scientists on TV in particular, and scientific institutions being reluctant to react and take risks in saying they are wrong? Gave the example of Rahul in France for COVID-19. We were talking earlier about shadow science. Now that may be perfectly legitimate. It's just a shadow set of, and Anne was referring to the situation in the UK. But in terms of the fake scientist, and then you go up against the fake scientist, and maybe you don't come out, you know, it can be, you know, a lot of casualties on both sides, as it were. How best to deal with that, particularly when the fake scientists get a lot of currency and what they're saying is getting a lot of traction, and therefore you may have even more risk by coming up against them. Matt, any thoughts on that?
I think it's hugely difficult in this age of social media, this emphasis on sensationalization. In many ways, the fake news is almost like a bait to try and pull academics into this sort of public argument where it's very hard for the academics to actually ever win. I think there's a really big role for the learned societies here in helping to protect, defend, and promote the public understanding of science in a way that is much stronger than it might have been previously. But it's a massive challenge. In some extent, it's one that it's very hard to actually win.
Any other thoughts on that, Roger?
Yeah, again, I think this is one where we scientists and experts get sucked into the content of the information. And so we talk about fake science versus real science. And for me, this issue is often more about trust and legitimacy of expert bodies than it is about the substance of the information. And here's a nuanced statement. We've learned through the work of Thomas Piketty and others that in Western Europe, in North America, that academics, scientists do not share the same overall political orientation of the publics of which they are a part. And so it's very easy for many in the public to see academics and scientists as more on the left, more elite, more urban. And when they look to other voices, they're not saying anything about the substance. They can't judge the substance of vaccination or climate change. What they're saying is, this other expert seems to reflect who I am better than these other folks. And for me, the way to deal with that is to create institutions of science advice that everyone in society can look to and say, yeah, I don't agree with everyone's politics on there, but I see them as legitimate because someone on that body reflects who I see myself as.
And just a quick one, linking to fake scientists, also the emergence that we're seeing increasingly of activist scientists who come from a particular perspective, are known to come from that perspective. Do you think that is or can be compatible with scientific integrity, with public service, or is it creating greater problems? Is it fueling this hostility towards science you don't want to hear and the sort of attacks we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I would definitely not equate science activists with fake science.
Indeed not, indeed not. I'm not trying to do so, but
and I mean, one of the things about the fake science that would help, I think, the media is if we look at things, again, in the UK, but also in Europe, we have science media centres, because there are very few journalists who are specialists in science. And so a science media centre can bring together scientific experts to help the media to untangle what's fake and what's real. So I think that's really helpful. The other aspect about science activism, I mean, if you look up Wikipedia science activists, I mean, what you see there are a whole list of people who come under that grouping. And what they are is there are people who have made themselves visible and have taken the time and actually devoted a lot of energy and come under a lot of attack about talking about specific issues that are important to them. So, you know, whether that's somebody like Tracy Brown and Sense About Science, or whether it's somebody like Ben Goldacre talking about the need for transparency in clinical trials, or Richard Dawkins talking about evolution and religion and the difference between the two. I mean, I think science activism, if we're calling it, I'm slightly uncomfortable about the terminology, but it's not a bad thing. It's scientists who are prepared to speak out about what they feel the evidence is and what's important.
so perhaps it's very much actually the development of that term which leads to the problem rather than the act itself. We are almost out of time, and I want to put you all on the spot. And just to say, there are a number of other questions about politicians ignoring your advice that I'd like to come back to in our next panel when we focus on that complexity of the close relationship between the scientist and the policymaker. But for each of you, and Lara, let me start with you. I'll go down the line, finish with Anne, the reverse to my first question. If you had to give one piece of advice to scientists who want to engage and give scientific advice, who want to get involved in the way you have with difficult topics, on how best to navigate the risks and deal with the threats, the concerns, the fears that they may have of being attacked, what would your overarching piece of advice be to them based on your experience and that of your colleagues?
As I said before, listen.
Yeah.
Think, ask questions, listen. And if I can have a second one, it would be very clear what evidence your advice is based on. I found that very, very helpful.
Thank you very much. Matt?
Overall, I'd say go for it. What a lot of scientists don't often understand is that engaging at the intersection of research and policy can actually be brilliant for increasing the standard and quality of your science itself. We shouldn't see them as two discrete processes. I would say to somebody, if possible, don't go on your own, build a team, find a coalition, and if possible, find a good mentor. We don't really understand as much as we should do about mentorship and why it really matters.
Thank you very much. Roger?
Yeah, my advice to scientists would be to appeal to the leaders of our communities, SAPIA, ALEA, Joint Research Commission, science academies. Ask them to help develop an ecosystem of institutions, of norms where you can thrive, where you feel safe, and you can come out in the public and actually be an advocate if you want to be an advocate, or be an advisor if you want to be an advisor. We need stronger scientific leadership at that interface of science and politics.
Thank you very much. Anne, you have the last word. Do you have a piece of advice for those who go through this?
Okay, well, I agree with everything that's been said. The only additional advice I think I would give is don't take it personally. So you do come under attack, but remember that those people who are attacking you don't know you. So they're attacking what you've said because you're having impact. So my advice would be, and it's not about being thick-skinned or thin-skinned, but it was advice given to me very early on, is they don't know you. So just keep giving the best advice you can, which is brought to you from that very wide network of the consensus.
Thank you very much indeed. Those of you in the room, will you join me in thanking our panel very much for... It's lovely to have you with us remotely. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much to all of you. We are going to come back on all of these issues, I know. We're going to delve into specifically the issue of climate change tomorrow. We're going to delve into the lessons of COVID in more detail tomorrow. And we are going to come back on these issues of, as I said, that relationship between the government science advisor and policymakers in much more detail in our next panel later on. We're going to take a break in a moment, but before we do that, I'd like to invite Piotr Magnuszewski, research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. He's just going to come and tell you a little bit about what is going to happen after the break. So Piotr.
Yes, thank you very much for coming, and it's been tremendous experience listening to everyone here, but we're also going to have a very different experience after the break where we're going to be engaged directly. So there will be something that we call social simulation or policy simulation, and it's very different. There will be time travel involved. There will be alternative universe similar to ours, so you might have a similar experience, but you will become someone else. So I hope you're excited, but I have a lot to ask you. I will ask you to talk to strangers. I will ask you to use your phones. I will ask you to move around in different places. And I would very, very much would like to ask you to follow all the instruction, ask if there is some confusion, which is unavoidable. And by the way, there is pressure. Yes, so that we all have a fantastic experience together. We will be all co-creating this. There's no ready script. So here comes request number one. During the refreshment, we have half an hour. Please jump into this alternative universe. There is a desk there, information desk about the social simulation, and you will be able already to become someone else. But here comes the related request that you have to come, two people, it should be a pair, and you should not know each other. So that's the stranger part which is coming. So you should find someone else who you don't know, form a pair, and then come to the desk, and Noam, who you can see in the back, will be welcoming you there and giving you different...
Wave again. There we are.
different roles. And that's it. Everything else will be said after the refreshment, but please do this during the refreshment so that we can start and we don't increase the pressure even more.
Thank you, Piotr. And just to say that those of you who are joining us online, you will also have a session, but it will be slightly different for obvious reasons. You can't form a pair unless you happen to be watching this with someone in your office, and then the odds are you'd know them. But you will also have a session. We're going to take that break now, as Piotr said, for 30 minutes. Coffee for those who are with us in the room is served outside. For those of you who are joining us online, put the kettle on. You'll have time to make a cup of tea, grab a biscuit, and then please be back sharp for 2:45. And I will see you all after the interactive policy simulation session for our panel later on the complex role of government science advice.